here to support black workers.
26 years and I was never promoted.
What do we want?
My name is Ginella Massa, and I'm here with Nicholas Marcus Thompson. He is the president and CEO of the Black Class Action Secretariat and is in the middle of what I can only describe as a David versus Goliath battle against the government of Canada, a 4-year-long legal case that is now culminating in a court hearing. And we want to break down a little bit what has brought us here to this class action lawsuit. Thousands of black federal public service workers suing the government of Canada. And take us back a little bit, Nicholas, to how this even started. How did you come to be suing the government for $2.5 billion?
Well, the legal case started 4 years ago, but this battle has been going on for much longer than that. It's been over 50 years where black workers show up to work in Canada's public service and really don't have access to the same opportunities as everyone else. And what that looks like for many people, it means showing up to work, it means not being seen, not being heard, not being respected, and doing that over and over and over. When you apply for jobs, you just don't get it for whatever reason. You're good enough to train people who go on to become your supervisor and an executive. And then you just remain stuck in that position for decades. And then you retire in that position. And your pension is based on your best 5 years. So imagine if your best 5 years is in an entry-level position, it means that your pension is going to be very minimal. And it also means that you'd be retiring with nothing. So you would have served your entire life, the government and people of Canada, without dignity. And then you also retire without dignity, unable to afford the basic necessities of life. And that's really why this fight is so important. It's to redress decades of harm and to provide some justice for those that Canada has harmed, and then also ensuring that the present employees and future employees do not have these barriers and can work with dignity and can retire with dignity and can take care of their families. The generational impact on discrimination, it's devastating, particularly for black families and homes and communities.
When you were working for CRA, you looked up these numbers: 46,000 black workers and 1 black executive in the entire country at that time.
So it's very interesting how rejection brought us here. Because at the time I was the president of the union at CRA in Toronto, and as we were looking at the data and the numbers, and in that very office there was just over 1,100 workers, and they had none in management that were black. And when we started exploring the issue further and beyond that office, the agency at the time had 46,000 workers, and they had 1 black executive throughout the country. And they maintained that they had a zero tolerance for racism and discrimination. Yet, they were actively preventing black people from advancing. And so the CRA's refusal to address this issue prompted us to look beyond the CRA. And that's when we went to the RCMP, and we went throughout the federal public service. We went to the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and workers across the board said that they were experiencing the same discrimination, the same tools that were being used, such as best fit. So you're qualified, you're right up there to be selected, and you're not selected because you're not probably culturally appropriate, or you're not the best fit for the role, and a very subjective criteria. And workers across the board told us how these tools were being used to exclude them in a practice that we've coined as Black employee exclusion. And all of this started at the CRA. Now, mind you, that goes to any life's lesson that rejection you shouldn't view rejection as rejection. Rejection is go another path. That's what rejection is. Don't give up in the face of rejection. Just open another door. And that's really why this is so significant. Now imagine if CRA had said, yes, we're going to implement these measures, and we're going to improve on Black hiring and ensure that everyone, because still there's a glass ceiling at the bottom for Blacks. Some racialized folks who were just in lower entry management positions were just above that, and the top was all white employees, right? So there were different barriers for different groups. And imagine CRA had said, yes, we'll do all of these things. We would have stopped. And that's what's really incredible about this is our perseverance and our determination to, when the door keeps shutting in our face, to keep going. And now we have a battle against 99 departments. And this battle is really for Canada and not against Canada, because Canada purports to be this, multicultural and diverse country, but really behind that, access to opportunity is not equal for everyone. And that is Canadian racism, Canadian discrimination. Very polite, very friendly. I'm so sorry you didn't get the job. Try again. And with a hug too, you might get a hug. But the reality is that type of discrimination, where it's so covert, it stabs you, and it creates a deep wound that doesn't ever heal.
Sometimes I refer to it as death by 1,000 cuts, right? It's not very the small, obvious and the blatant big stab. It's a million little cuts over and over and over again. But I think we should also be clear, as much as there is polite racism and less overt racism, there is also blatant racism, blatant discrimination, and it's been documented. Can you talk about some of the things we've heard and some of the things we've read in reports about the blatant discrimination that's happening?
Well, I think it's like those are the really hard stories to talk about. Dr. Zellers, a professor at St. Mary's University, has done many reports in the public service, and her reports usually expose what those blatant forms of discrimination are. And I don't even want to say imagine the N-word being used, because they leaders in the public service actively use the N-word.
And some claimed to not know it was a pejorative.
It's not even shocking, but rather disturbing, because we've heard it over and over that, these leaders just, there's so much immunity, and they use, they carry themselves, the leadership of Canada's public service, on racism and zero respect for Black people. And it's very evidence. The comment was, quote, "I'm going to beat the N-word out of you," in front of other people.
And nothing happened.
No accountability, right? In another instance, two racialized workers are, having a chat in the office, talking about, how challenging the workload gets, and, they're a little stressed about it. And a white manager walks up to them and says, "We should go back to the good old days where we had slaves." And, for that worker, one Black and one racialized, the sheer audacity to walk up to somebody, it's one thing to think about it, which is bad enough, But to walk up to someone and reveal that and say it.
Say the quiet part out loud.
Yeah, it's just extremely disturbing, knowing that nothing would happen to him, right?
And we're talking about in a government setting.
Yes, and this is an area. This is the immigration, the refugee board. This is an area that welcomes people to Canada, and boasts of its multiculturalism, and it tells new immigrants and those who want to come here that this is a place of diversity and inclusivity, and that everyone is welcome and valued, and this is how it treats its own employees. So that's really, really staggering.
You've just mentioned a couple of different departments: CRA, Armed Forces, IRCC, and I think the magnitude of this can't be understated. You are suing 99 departments, governmental departments in the public service. And this is unprecedented. We can't go and paint the entire public service of 99 departments with the same brush. When you hear that, what's your response?
Well, Canada continues to contradict itself. In the public domain, Minister Anita Anand, the Prime Minister, heads of departments, they all maintain that systemic discrimination is the lived reality of Black people across the public service. They've all admitted it, from the Canadian Human Rights Commission to the CRA. They acknowledge it. In the court, it's saying that there's only instances of discrimination, which is really dishonest and misleading to Canadians. And Canadians should be really outraged that
These are our tax dollars.
Yes, that taxpayers are funding this to the tune of millions of dollars. And, to tell Canadians one thing in the public domain, hey, we know that this issue is widespread across the board. It is systemic. And then to go to the court and say, no, there's only instances of discrimination. That is a blatant lie.
One of the things that the government is saying in their defense against this lawsuit is that, yes, this does exist, but there are other means of recourse, and that the court isn't the way to deal with this. That folks should go through the Federal Labor Board. They should go to the Canadian Human Rights Commission. Can you talk particularly about that piece, the Canadian Human Rights Commission being a place to go for these kinds of grievances?
Well, let's start with not what I make of it, but what the government of Canada has made of the issue. The government of Canada has made a clear finding that the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the body that Canada created to address discrimination within the federal public service, they've determined that that body has discriminated against Black and racialized workers. So how could workers turn to this commission? How could Canada be seriously saying that this is an effective remedy, an effective mechanism to address systemic anti-Black discrimination, when itself has determined that they're discriminating against workers? And not just only us in Canada. The Canadian government and workers are saying that this is not, an effective remedy. But also the body that accredits the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the Global Alliance for National Human Rights Institutions, have said they're concerned with Canada's ability to address these issues. If we come back right here at home, the very employees at the commission are saying that it's so toxic there. When they make decisions to screen a complaint and they determine that there's some merit for it to move forward to the tribunal, that when that goes up to their white supervisor, that it's disproportionately rejected. They talk about all white investigative teams investigating race-based complaints. And what's usually the outcome? A disproportionate rejection of those complaints. So this is the body, the Canadian Human Rights Commission is the body that Canada is saying is a viable means for workers to get redress. So that means in the federal public service and federally regulated workspace, if you experience discrimination, this is the body that you go to file your complaint. And you find the courage and you go to the Canadian Human Rights Commission. It sends you back to deal with the people who've abused you, forcing you to go back through that process.
I want to go back a little bit because you talk about the grievance process, which I think it's important to mention is different for unionized workers than it is for managers.
Mm-hmm. So a large portion of Canada's federal public service is unionized. Right? And then there are non-unionized workers, people who doesn't have a collective agreement and are not represented by a union. And those could be students, those could be managers, and then executives. Managers don't have those rights to file a grievance, and executives don't have those rights. Now, they are all proposed class members. Any Black person that worked for the federal public service from 1970 up until present, as well as job applicants, this class action is on all of their behalf. But Canada's response to it is that there's these mechanisms, but not everyone has access to those mechanisms, beside it being ineffective.
One of the things you're fighting for is the fact that folks weren't able to get promotions. You know, we've spoken with one gentleman, 51 years in CRA and one promotion, his last promotion in 1975. And then we hear about those who do get the promotion, who do make it into those executive level positions. And it appears that getting that title doesn't offer them any sort of immunity. Were you surprised by that?
I wasn't surprised because we've heard from executives for a long time that they face significant barriers and discrimination to get there, to get to that level. And even when they get to that level, it becomes even worse because now you don't have access to any mechanisms that may provide some relief. You don't have access to talk to anyone. You become so isolated. Dr. Zellers described the report as the experiences of workers as cruel, inhumane, subjugation. That means having a certain dominance over people, right? The report showed that women were disproportionately impacted, that they faced the most egregious type of oppression within that structure in terms of career advancement, career stagnation,
and harassment.
And harassment. Some point out about sexual harassment. So being placed in really vulnerable position, and the feeling of being powerless and controlled. There's so much power that senior executives are wielding over Black people. It's almost as if they're imprisoned mentally and otherwise, unable to carry out their duties, unable to complain, face retaliation, and how these senior leaders have weaponized the complaints process, keeping them in a state of constant fear, keeping them imprisoned, and all to control them. And that's what's really disturbing, is that there's so much harm. And at least at the lower levels, you might have, you might feel open to sharing more, but at the executive level, you can't talk because you're bound by so much more. And, some workers have attempted suicide. Some have actually committed suicide because their workspace is so toxic. They have nowhere to go. And if you complain, your career is dead. And if you leave on bad terms, your career is dead. Nobody's going to hire you. In the executive community, as a Black person, you don't get the opportunity to make any mistakes. The smallest mistake, you're severely punished for it. It's just really heartbreaking. You fight so hard to get there. A lot of the black people at the lower levels are more qualified than the folks who are above them. So they're viewed as a threat.
They're training people who then become their supervisors.
Absolutely, absolutely. And let's take the case of one gentleman, Gerard Etienne. He has 3 master's degrees, 3 bachelor's degrees, and I think he's just finishing his PhD. And when he should have been an executive level 5, he was an executive level 3. To put that into perspective, there's 1 to 5 in the executive level in Canada's leadership, the senior levels. And he had more qualification than those who were above him. Yet still he faced constant barriers. Every decision he made was questioned. And moving up just wasn't a possibility. So even at that level, he was stuck. And because Canada has to show some diversity, they allow some black people into the executive rank. Mind you, a very small number. For many years, in 2016, there was 68 black executives.
Wow.
And 4 years later, we're at 200 black executives. So, and this is a public service of over 300,000. But they're all staggered mostly in the entry-level position. We'll bring you on board. You'll do some work, but that door largely remained closed. And when you leave and when you retire, you're not going to be remembered. You're not going to get the pension that you deserve or should have had.
You talk about decades of discrimination. What struck you about the stories from decades ago versus the stories from now?
And there's one particular story that comes to mind, the Black Battalions, where black soldiers, black Canadians in the First World War said they wanted to serve Canada. And Canada told them that they couldn't, that this was a white man's war. And eventually Canada allowed them to serve in a very limited capacity. Canada created a unit called the Black Battalion. And this Black Battalion, many of them were not allowed to fight alongside the white soldiers. They were given hand-me-down uniforms, treated horribly. And only a few was allowed to serve with the regular battalions. And the Black Battalion, their job was to cut down the trees, defuse the landmines, and dig the trenches. And that was the early public service in 1914. Fast forward to over 100 years later, and black workers in the armed forces are still, cutting down the trees and digging the trenches.
Mm.
And it's very important work that Canadians, rely on. When you contact the CRA or Service Canada, the person that answers the phone, these are these workers. And career progression is not an option for these workers. So while Canada is saying, we'll let you in the door, because black people are the largest racialized group in Canada's public service, making up just over 11,000 workers. But it is the least paid group. So it's the same Black Battalion story over and over and over again.
When you look at the numbers, when you look at the stats, there's no shortage of federal government-funded reports that support what you are saying. Mm-hmm. We've talked a little bit about the Senate report on the Canadian Human Rights Commission. We've talked about the report on the Black Executive Network, also a government-funded study. Then there's the Privy Council Office internal audit, which only became public because you filed an access to information request. What did that report find?
So the internal report at the Privy Council Office found that, black people and racialized Indigenous people were, across the board at the Privy Council Office were in entry-level positions. And they were clustered there and not even permanent, largely temporary. The turnover was very high for them. And at the executive level, it was largely white people in permanent positions. The culture was very toxic. It wasn't safe. Sentiments about, anti-black discrimination, about Islamophobia, about racialized minority. It was, it was horrible for these workers. And, again, racial slurs, microaggressions. And the Privy Council office is the head of the public service. They're the ones who are telling everyone else to address racism and discrimination. They're the ones who are telling the rest of the public service, hey, you have to address racism. You have to address discrimination for Black and racialized communities, indigenous communities. And here they are, the biggest perpetrator of discrimination in the public service was this office, the Privy Council office, which oversees the public service, which is the Secretary to the Cabinet of Canada, Secretary to the Prime Minister of Canada. And in analogy terms, this is the head of the snake and the most lethal and dangerous part. We have sought to bring that report before the courts. And Canada's argument was so interesting because, they said, this is the Privy Council office is just one area. It doesn't have anything to do with the rest of the public service, has nothing to do with this case or certifying it. And the reality was the Privy Council appointed deputy ministers across the public service. They are the leader. And the court ultimately agreed that, yes, there is some merit to this because this is the head of the public service. How could you say that this had nothing to do with this case or it's just one area when this was the area leading everywhere else?
The government of Canada has spent millions of dollars trying to keep this case out of away from becoming a class action. 4 years of a legal battle, millions of dollars. What do you make of the fact that Canada is spending so much time and effort and money to end this when they have settled other class actions?
Well, the simple answer to that, I think, is racism. There's so much racism within this process of seeking justice for Black workers. Canada is saying in the court that the court is not the right place for these issues, and that there are internal mechanisms to the government, like the grievance, Canadian Human Rights Commission, etc., that workers have redress in. But those same mechanisms were also available to women that filed complaints, lawsuit. They were available to 2S LGBT community who were purged from the armed forces. They were available to so many others. And Canada settled those class actions. And in my personal opinion, rightfully so, because those communities were harmed and the court provided the effective redress and remedies to make them whole again as much as possible. So then, why would you put up all of this fight and spend so much money to redress the harm that you've acknowledged that you've caused Black workers? Why is it all of a sudden precedent setting? It wasn't precedent setting. You weren't concerned that you'd open the floodgates, when you settled in so many other areas. You weren't concerned that all the other groups that you've harmed would come knocking on the door. But suddenly, with Black workers, you're so concerned about it setting a dangerous precedent. Now workers have access to all of these mechanisms. But in the other cases, they did have access to those mechanisms too. but it wasn't a problem for you. And that's why we maintain that there's so much racism in the process. When we were going through cross-examinations to get to this stage, Canada refused for us to use the word black. We couldn't say black in this case because there is no black in the Employment Equity Act. Canada corrected us. There's no black, it's visible minorities. There's no black. So even in trying to get redress, even in trying to get justice, Canada continues to harm our communities so much.
And erase your experience, because it is a unique one. As Black Canadians, your history is unique. Your experiences of racism and discrimination are unique. And we know often that even the diversity mechanisms least benefit Black people. So I think it has to be important that unique experience be identified.
And I think that, you see, Canada has done it for so many other groups. But on the Black issue, the anti-Black racism and discrimination is so deeply entrenched. I'll give you an example. When there are issues impacting the 2S LGBTQIA plus communities, solutions are geared towards addressing those issues. When there are issues impacting Islamophobia, impacting anti-Semitism, or any other issues, indigenous issues, those communities get the priority that's needed in many ways, still, in my view, shortcoming. But when it comes to anti-Black discrimination, everyone raises their hands. What about us? There's a special, there's a special representative for Islamophobia. There's two for anti-Semitism. There's systems for 2S LGBTQIA communities. Canada has no permanent structures to address anti-Black discrimination, which has been the longest in this country in terms of discrimination, in terms of oppression. Even before Canada was a country, to the transatlantic slave trade, Black people were one of the first groups here, right? In the 1600s. And even to today, these systemic barriers from so long ago are still up, and Black people still don't have that recognition that the International Decade for People of African Descent calls for. It still doesn't have the development, and it still doesn't have the justice. And all of these three things is what this class action is seeking to do. But because the racism is still so deeply entrenched, it makes people so fearful of giving what's rightfully deserved to the Black community, the justice. And it's not a handout. Mind you, this class action is not seeking handouts. It is seeking what Canada took away, what Canada denied qualified Black people from, right? Who were qualified, who were competent, who were good enough to train others, who were good enough to act in higher positions only temporarily. The Statistics Canada says Black people are most qualified in terms of post-secondary education. So it's not because of education. It's not because of being unable to do the job. The clear reason is because of their race, because they were Black. And make no mistake, there's no disagreement here. Canada is not saying this isn't happening.
They've acknowledged and admitted.
They've said it over and over. Several presidents of the Treasury Board, Mona Fortier, Anita Anand, attorney generals, the prime minister, everybody said it over and over. It's systemic, and we're working to address it. Like, it's been decades that you're working to address it, and nothing has worked, and it hasn't worked. I'll tell you why. So listen up closely. I'll tell you why. The same leaders who have done this is who Canada has called on to fix it. Very simple. the same leaders who are discriminating, who are oppressing Black people, who are doing everything the Zellers report pointed out on several occasions, with many recommendations still not implemented, those are the leaders that Canada has tasked to address the issue. So how could it ever change? How could it ever be resolved when the oppressors are responsible for implementing the solutions? That's a non-starter in any business. In any viable or functioning business, if a manager or CEO is causing the harm and the company is losing money, the board of directors would never call on those same people to fix it. What would it do? Bring in a new CEO, bring in new managers in any properly functioning company. That's what would happen. But in the public service, there's zero accountability on racism and discrimination. Zero accountability. And that's why we continue to call for a Black Equity Commissioner, because the public service is so entrenched in racism, it doesn't know where to start to address it. And we want to have a body that's independent from the public service, that has the policing powers, that has the ability to direct departments on addressing these issues and holding them accountable. Then reporting to the parliament, is free from political interference or interference from the bureaucracy that has its own functioning office and staff that would have a mandate to do this work across the public service. Now, that's a real deterrence towards discriminating against anyone. And that's what the public service has lacked for a very long time. When there's discrimination, they just move someone around. No accountability. They sign an NDA or a memorandum of agreement, and you don't get to talk about it. That person stays in power. There's no acceptance of liability or that anything wrong happened, and then it just goes away, and the discrimination happens to somebody else in a different place at a different time.
And I think that distinction is important, because often what they'll say is, we're consulting community. We're working on all these anti-discrimination initiatives, and we're bringing in folks to be at the table.
First of all, none of these measures have been realized. So it means to say the harm is continuing today. Canada's Black mental health program for Black public service workers have not treated a single worker since it was announced in 2021. These measures are forward-looking, and at present they're performative. They haven't realized any change. And these measures do not address the harm that Canada has acknowledged that it has inflicted on Black workers for decades. So Canada says, okay, we'll create this program. And they only had white people working on a program to address anti-Black discrimination. And when the Black Employee Network spoke up and says, well, where are the Black people? Canada says, okay, fine. We'll bring on a few Black people to work on this program. And they did. But those Black people were largely, doing the work at the ground level. And when they passed the work up to their senior leaders, well, those leaders would question, well, why do you need this? Why do you need that in the program? Why are you Black people like this? Why can't you just accept? Why do you even need this program dedicated to addressing racial trauma for Black people? Now, mind you, the parliament already gave direction to create this. And here you have leaders in the bureaucracy questioning, why do you need it? And when Black workers present solutions that they believe is needed to address these issues, their white leaders are shut it down. Undermine it, fizzle it down to nothing. And that's really why, as well, you don't have the measures end up being performative. Then they launch a Black action plan to oversee this work. And then they put a non-Black person to lead the work for a long time. So Minister Anita Anand said in February, the workers at Treasury Board were briefing her on this mental health program. There were no black people briefing her on a black mental health program. She said how problematic that was. But then what did you do about it? Canada has spent millions of dollars fighting black workers in court, more than $10 million. And that's more than they've actually spent on the solutions towards addressing the harm that they have caused. There's this one lady who came forward. Her name is Carol. And she was forced to retire after 26 years because her doctor forced her out. She just kept bleeding in the workplace. And when she stopped going to work, the bleeding would stop. Every time she'd go to work, she'd start back bleeding. And she had to retire after 26 years. She now lives in a basement apartment. She can't afford the basic necessities of life. She always got best performance ratings. And applying after applying, she never got those opportunities. And then she was forced to retire. So how are any of these measures making Carol whole again? She went through the grievance process. She went through the Canadian Human Rights Commission. She went to the Federal Labor Relations Board. No justice in any of these systems. Anytime you ask Carol to share a story, she's crying. She still carries all of the pain, all of the suffering. And then you announce you're doing a mental health program. You announce these measures that have not been realized, and that's enough? It's nothing short of shameful.
What's it like sitting in court and listening to the government make their arguments in this case for 12 days?
Well, it's very painful. Sometimes I leave. I have to compose myself because the arguments that Canada is making in the court, it looks really good on paper. They say, well, Your Honor, we have all of these staffing processes and checks and balance and merit-based, and it looks really good on paper, and it sounds really good. But in practicality, in practical terms, when we look at all of these things, there's a lot of discretion in it. So when a manager apply their biases to it, for example, I'll give you a perfect example. As a hiring manager, I can look at anybody in the room and say, you know what, Ginella, I'm going to give you an opportunity. I'm going to develop you at a higher level. So I'm going to give you a promotion for 6 months, less a day. Because the staffing regime, first, the legislation gives the power to departments to create their own staffing. Unions have no say in that. And those staffing policies is what the employers follow. So the staffing power is given to me as the delegated manager. I can hire you. I could give you a promotion without any recourse to anyone else. Unadvertised staffing, it's called. And I can develop you. And then let's say you're at level 1 and you get that promotion to act at a higher level in, let's say, level 2. After the 6 months, I have the authority to go back to HR and say, you know what? There are some operational needs and I need to extend that for another 6 months. Still, no recourse to anyone else. And nobody can challenge it because it's within my staffing discretion. Now Ginella has 12 months experience in this higher position. So you know what? As the manager, I think I'm ready to fill that position permanently, that level 2 position, and I'm looking for someone with 12 months experience in that level 2 position. Well, Nicholas and all the other employees didn't have that experience, so they can't even apply.
That's because you didn't give them the opportunity.
They can't even complain because they don't have the experience. They didn't get the opportunity to get the experience. And who usually gets those developmental opportunities? White and non-black employees. So on paper, what the government is saying looks good, but it doesn't show this level of discretion. And And that's the experience of many black workers. So they're not getting the experience to be developed like other employees. And then we do that process over and over again. Repeats that cycle, brings in people that looks just like her over and over again. Meanwhile, the folks who are not getting the opportunities can't even seek recourse.
Because technically they've checked marked.
Yeah. All
They've
the
met the
boxes are
criteria.
checked. All the boxes are checked. And when you come down to the other place now, which is they have to follow and meet employment equity. So black people, when we look at the Employment Equity Act, which we are seeking a declaration from the court that it's unconstitutional, the visible minorities category, it doesn't break down anyone in there. So the legislation, that act, creates 4 groups for protection to ensure, because back in 1986, they determined that these groups are vulnerable groups and they would likely face discrimination if they don't receive protection. So let us name them in the legislation to ensure that employers treat them fairly. Women, indigenous people, people with disabilities, and visible minorities. On the visible minorities, they didn't define any of the groups. Now, because it doesn't define any group, as the hiring manager, I could pick the same group over and over and meet and exceed employment equity. Now, when it comes to black people, they're not usually selected for those opportunities. And the hiring manager, I could say, I did pick a racialized person. I've met the definition of the act. And they've told me, Nicholas, it's not my fault. I've chosen a racialized person. I've followed the legislative requirements and our policy. It doesn't say anything about black, and that's it. If you want this fixed, a director told me this at the CRA, Nicholas, if you want this issue fixed, you have to go change the Employment Equity Act. He told me that. and that's what we...
And so that's what you're doing.
And that's what we set out to do. And, you know, and Canada has, you know, they've acknowledged it politically. It says that, yes, we're going to change the act and we're going to recognize black people. And that's
but
really good.
But they haven't done it yet.
They haven't done it yet. They've only committed to doing it last year. It's almost a year now. They haven't done it as yet. I think that would be historic once it's done. It's going to help a lot of people. And it's going to start redressing those harms.
So as people are watching and listening to this, feeling angry, whether they're black or not, maybe feeling helpless, what can people do to support this cause?
Yeah, you know, every Canadian should be very much outraged that the people who are serving them are actively being harmed, right? Those people who are being harmed, the black people who are going to work at Service Canada, throughout the federal government, Parks Canada, every system, every government resource that you use, those people are being harmed. They're showing up to work, you know, in fear. They're showing up to work not being able to serve at their full capacity, their production level. And imagine you as a Canadian, you're getting that service and you're not getting the best service because the person who's serving you is being denied opportunities. They're facing depression, they're facing anxiety, they're facing so much oppression in the workplace. You should be concerned that your tax dollars is funding this. So you should be going to your member of parliament. You should be writing to the prime minister. You should be saying, hey, this has to stop. This is not our Canada. These are not our values. And we have to stop this practice. Canadians should be outraged that their tax dollars is funding this discrimination at the highest level. And there's zero accountability. So as key stakeholders in this, as Canadians, you should be really concerned that this is how your money is being spent. This is how the people who are serving you, you know, this is how they're being treated horribly. You should be concerned. And we've created a bunch of tools for people to express that. If you go to blackclassaction.ca /takeaction, you'll see templates to write to your MP. You'll see the petition. You'll see several campaigns that you could participate in. They're already done. So all you have to do is plug in your details and fire it off.
let's say this lawsuit does get certified as a class action. What happens next? And do people have to sign up to receive damages?
The certification process in a class action is like the first major hurdle. Then it actually has to go to a trial, right? Canada can choose to allow the class action to be certified with any liability or admission of guilt or just to get past this administrative process. It has chosen not to do so. It has chosen to fight Black workers and re-traumatize them in the process over and over. Every time you hear a story being told, it's, and a defense for these injustices, it's horrible. So once this class action is certified, all the people would be notified that they are involved in this class action. They wouldn't have to sign up, but there would be an order that the government provided information for everyone. And all Black workers would be notified. If the court accepts our definition of the class, which is any person that worked for the federal government from 1970 to present, except contractors. If you bid for a contract and you got a contract, then that does not apply. But all Black workers, from students to executives, full-time, part-time, as long as you identify as Black and you work for the federal government, or you applied for a job in the federal government and were denied on account of your race, those people, the government would have to provide those names and we would notify them that they're part of this class action. Generally, at that stage, if the class action is settled and won, all of those people would be required to put in a claim for compensation, which would not be the same threshold as the evidentiary threshold in a court where there's cross-examination and all of that. It would be a much simple process that you would claim compensation in.
Are you hopeful for an outcome?
Well, I think what the government of Canada does not realize is that we have a much powerful force that is behind us in this class action. And we have the sling of David, and it is being slung. And that brings a lot of hope that at the end of this long journey, we will prevail. And our public service would become a place where Black, racialized and Indigenous people, where everyone would be able to show up, would be able to work hard, serve Canadians, would be able to apply for jobs that they're qualified for, and get those jobs, would not have those barriers. And just imagine what the policies of Canada would be if everyone is at the table. Imagine the vibrant policies that our communities would benefit from when all of these diverse voices are making policies across the country. How much better would our country be at all levels when everyone is getting to contribute to their fullest potential? That's the Canada that we're fighting for. That's the Canada that we're dreaming of. And that's the Canada that we hope would be realized one day.
Nicholas, I'm going to leave it there. You have had a big fight and hopefully not much longer to go. We're wishing you all the best with this case and look forward to its resolution. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.